Now we've come to a time in our service when I lead us through a conversation about a text from Scripture. And the last couple of weeks, we have sort of set up what we're going to be talking about this year. We're going to be talking about sin and ultimately salvation. It's a very happy topic, isn't it? And yet it is a topic that touches on all of our lives, not just as individuals, but as communities, as churches, as organizations, as nations. Last week we looked at sin in theological perspective. We read Isaiah 59, 1 through 8, and we noticed that God in that text gives Israel His perspective on the way that they had been living for centuries. And we said that this was particularly important because God was speaking not to random people out there, but to the ones who identified themselves by their knowledge of Him. God was speaking to His people and indicting them for their sin, not pointing out the sin of all those other people out there. But now in our verses, the prophet responds to God's observations on behalf of the nation. And the nation gives its own perspective on the sin in its ranks. Now, sin is an unpleasant topic, but it is one that we must all deal with. And I would argue, in fact, that it is one that stands behind many of the social, cultural, political conflicts that we have in our nation today. And not just in our nation. Sin is something that permeates every aspect of every human society. I'll illustrate it this way. When I was in my PhD work, I noticed a substantial difference, of course, between myself and many of my professors, most of my professors, in fact, and some of my fellow students as well. I came from a church background that was conservative, Protestant, and not just conservative theologically, but politically. I came from the rural South, much like this kind of church, And my professors had a very different view of the world than I did. And I wanted to try to understand what that difference was. And at the time, the way I framed it was that my understanding of sin was that it was an individual phenomenon and a cosmic phenomenon. Now we're going to talk about sort of the cosmic side of sin much later this year, okay? So you can just kind of put that aside for a moment. But I saw sin as something that individuals do, right? The way that I evaluated my professors, and I even talked to one or two of them about it, they saw sin as something that was social, something that was institutional, something that was systemic. Okay? So that's how I understood the contrast. The problem is, the picture the Bible gives us is more complicated than that. But before we get to the Bible picture, I want to illustrate for you that this differentiation between sin as individual guilt and sin as corporate or social or systemic problem is not just something that happened at Texas Christian University. And it's not even something that simply separates, political liberals from political conservatives. You'll see that I've displayed the pictures of two men on the screen. You probably have heard of these two men, or at least one of them. They were both prominent political and cultural figures in the 1990s. And they agreed about a lot of things. Rush Limbaugh was a conservative radio talk show host. Bill McCartney was a football coach at the University of Colorado who also founded the men's ministry Promise Keepers. As I said, they had a lot in common. But they had one big difference. I'm not sure that either of them actually realized that they had this difference, but they did. Christianity Today did some reporting on this when McCartney passed away on January 10th. For Limbaugh, he worked in his professional life with working class, mostly, working class, middle class, white Americans who were tired of being blamed for things that they didn't do. So Limbaugh tended to see evil, sin, wrongdoing, things like that. Limbaugh didn't use the theological terminology of sin very often. He tended to see those as individual realities, as something that you need to talk to the individual who messed up, not something that is permeating society or whatever, not something that has these long-term bigger impacts. And you understand why he had that perspective. Even Ezekiel, I think it's Ezekiel 18, has this conversation between the people of Israel and God, and the people of Israel are complaining to God, hey, look, it's our ancestors who sinned and now you're punishing us. And God says, well, that's not exactly the case. You're not really being honest about that, but okay, good enough. From now on, each person will die for their own sin. We'll do it that way, So, but for McCartney worked with a lot of young African American men who still struggled to face and overcome the obstacles of hundreds of years of state-sponsored oppression. Yes, Jim Crow was gone. Yes, slavery had been gone for over 100 years, but he saw that the consequences of those behaviors still endured. And so for him, he wanted the men who came to his ministry to understand that enduring connection between sin and social life. So what did he do? He took the controversial step, and yes, it was controversial, of asking the Caucasian men who came to his ministries, to his big events, those big stadium events. You remember them from the 90s. Get all these, get 50,000 men together. I don't know, for some of you women, that might be kind of scary, having that many men in the same room. It's, you might be thinking, great, they're just going to belch and tell stories all the time. Make each other. No, but McCartney said, no, we're going to do more than just that. We're going to take responsibility for our actions and for the actions of those who come before us. And so he took the controversial step of asking Caucasian men to build friendships with African American men and to apologize to them for the things that had been done to them and to ask them for forgiveness. That's something Limbaugh would really never have done. Even though Limbaugh worked with African American men in his professional life every day, his call screener, he called him Bo Snerdley, was an African American guy. Actually, it was two different African American guys who filled that role. But that's not the way Limbaugh thought. It is the way McCartney thought. And McCartney persisted even when people started leaving his ministry because of his emphasis on racial reconciliation. Now, here's the thing that's so important. That very basic disagreement extends far beyond the issue of race. It's part of what's behind the whole church hurt question these days, where churches have done really stupid things when reports of abusive behavior have come to the fore. It's part of what stands behind a lot of people's cynicism about institutions of all types, whether it's government or education or the military or police or churches or whatever. Okay? It's this question of people look around and they go, wait a minute, I get it that people do stuff wrong, but man, it shouldn't be this bad, is it? Why is it like this? And that's why we turn to the Bible. That's why we turn to Christian theology to help us understand what is the relationship between sin and society. And it is a more complex relationship, I think, either than Limbaugh or McCartney fully appreciated. Though I don't think that either one of them would probably have disagreed with what I'm about to say. The first observation that we need to make is one made by theological ethicist Louise Kretschmer. All moral action originates in a person. That's part of what it means to be a person in the biblical sense, is that you are able to make moral decisions. You are able to take morally evaluative actions. In other words, you're able to do something that someone else can say, well, that is moral or that's immoral. When a lion eats a deer, we don't make a moral judgment on that. Because a lion is not a person in that sense. He's just a hungry animal who needs to eat a deer. So we don't punish the lion for murder because, that's just what lions do. They eat deer. But for a person, we are able to evaluate their behavior. And so what that means is that accountability for moral actions begins with the individual. The truth is, a lot of systems, economic, institutional, criminal justice, other organizational, a lot of systems will work as long as humans don't mess them up. But we're real good at messing them up, aren't we? But as I said, the picture's more complicated than that. And we see hints of this in our text this morning. Well, first of all, you've got the problem of collective action, right? So we have a church meeting, and we decide, you know what? We're going to make our budget this month by robbing banks. Now, even if we just send Roy out to do the bank robberies, the guilt accrues to all of us, right? Because we all decided to do it. We all put him up to do it. So that's part of the problem of collective action. But there's another problem. And this is the one that our text is really hitting on. What happens when a particular pattern of sin is so pervasive that it contaminates the whole society or the whole group? It is the issue of, you probably have heard this phrase, organizational culture, right? Sometimes you've walked into a workplace, right? And you almost feel the anger in the workplace. And even before you start working there, you start thinking, I might ought to start looking for another job. And you've been there about 3 hours and you're like, yep, I need to start looking for another job. Because not only have you been cussed out by your boss, but you've been cussed out by 2 workers and 3 subordinates. And you're like, that's just how this place works. I think I'm getting out of here. You know? Or maybe you've walked into a church. Natalia and I have had this experience. You've walked into a church and something just doesn't feel right. Something just doesn't feel right. And sometimes you get around and you start talking to people and it's just like, it's like the sum of the parts is bigger than the whole. Because there's a few people that you talk to and you go, man, you are really neat. I really like being around you. You're way more spiritually mature than I am. Why is this place so, why do I feel like it's so dead? Why is there so much darkness here? Why is my spirit so unsettled? And it's because, there are 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, 8 or 10 people scattered around the congregation that are truly wonderful people, but far more pervasive is this problem of sin. And when you just walk in, you don't know what that is. You don't know how pervasive it is. So you've got the problem of collective, not just collective action, but of pervasive wrongdoing. The problem of organizational culture. And then you have this other problem, that for certain sins, for certain wrongdoings, the consequences last long after the action. I talked last week about Diane Langberg, who's been working with victims of sexual abuse for more than 50 years. She is literally the pioneer of this field. And she's a Christian. And what she will tell you is, yes, any kind of sexual abuse has long-running ramifications, and it does. The trauma literally changes the way people's brain works. But then imagine that you've got an entire family permeated by a pattern of incest for generation after generation after generation. Even if a woman, and it's usually a woman, not always, but usually a woman, tries to break free from that pattern, comes to a pioneering professional in the field like Diane, it's still going to take generations to undo that damage. It's sort of like, she likens it to turning around a cruise ship. In one generation, you start the turn. Then in the next generation, you kind of get to the apex of the turn, but you're still not really turned. And then the third generation, then you're finally going in sort of the right direction. So you see, there are so many ways that sin begins in the heart and the hands of the individual, but then spreads out. We talked, I think I made this point last week or week before last, it really is a lot like a cancer that metastasizes. So now I want us to look even more closely at our text. What is it that the people of God observed about sin in their own context? How did it affect them? Well, one thing that they observed is that it robbed the people of those things that they needed, the resources that they needed to build a healthy society. Guess what? If you don't have truth, justice, righteousness, you cannot build a healthy society. The American founders knew that. They knew, especially a society that is self-governing, you cannot have a healthy, free society without a virtuous populace. And that is exactly what the people of Israel are observing. They are observing this lack of institutional and personal honesty, truth. They're observing this lack of personal integrity, righteousness. They're observing this lack of institutional integrity, justice. You see that in verse 9. You see it in verse 11, 12. And then you see it again in verses 14 and 15. They just keep coming back to that theme. But now I want you to look there at verse 10. We're going to come back to the second half of verse 9 in just a second. But I want you to look there at verse 10. It talks about we're like blind people. We're like groping around like blind people. It's like we can't see even though it's midday. If you can't see at midday, you can't see at all, right? It's like, and he gives several of these analogies to describe a people that do not know how to live anymore. Now, one of the things that we have said at this church over and over again since I've been the pastor here is, people learn how to be human by watching other humans, for good or for ill. Okay? And so what happens? People lose the ability to perceive how they should and should not live. Now look back up there at 9b, the second half of verse 9. Very similar idea. Notice how it's talking about we looked for light, but all we got was darkness. Now normally, not always, but normally in ancient literature, light and darkness are symbols for either truth and falsehood or good and evil. But not in this case. In this case, they are symbols for prosperity. Prosperity, not just in the sort of, piling up money things. And we're not talking about, necessarily just Scrooge McDuck swimming in all of his cash. Some of you who remember your 1980s and 1990s cartoons. We're not just talking about that. We're talking about prosperity in every sense, in every avenue of life. And they've lost the way. They don't know how to get there. Arthur Brooks, the Harvard University economist, would describe it as a lack of hope. Remember, hope from a sociological perspective is the sense that you can do something good, something positive to affect your well-being and the well-being of your family. They don't know how to live morally, and they don't know how to find their way to prosperity. Yes, human societies can become that corrupt. They can become that broken. We live in one that is very quickly moving that direction. If you've been doing any reading at all over the last 5 years, 10 years, You've seen writers, Christian and non-Christian, talking about the crisis of despair. Despair in the inner city. Despair in rural places all over the country. Despair in places that used to be hotbeds for manufacturing. Despair everywhere. Well, that's what verse 11 talks about. Look at that wonderful imagery there. We all growl like bears. We all moan mournfully like doves. There is just this perpetual emotional distress. And that's what happens to people when they don't know how they ought to live, how they ought to order their lives. The social historian David Brooks likes to say that the most useless thing we tell people at graduation speeches is, you can be anything you want. First of all, because it's not true. I mean, if somebody offers me a job as a backhoe driver, you should run. You should move to a different, forget a different city. You need to move to a different state. That's not going to be good. You can't be anything that you want, but even beyond that, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And Brooks has taught enough at Yale and other places to know that a lot of his students were coming out of even Ivy League schools not knowing who they should be. Yuval Levine, the Orthodox Jewish scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, has made the same observation. Our academic institutions don't teach people in such a way as to form them into good citizens. Brooks made the same observation. And in fact, what brought Brooks in part to Christianity was he had a secretary, an assistant, she was more than a secretary, who had graduated from Wheaton College, a very prestigious Christian college in the Chicago area. And he saw in her something he wasn't seeing in his Yale students. She knew who she was. She knew who she was supposed to be. Here's the scary part. Notice the last observation. It's there at the end of verse 15. Or not, well, at the end of verse 15 before the break. Unfortunately, the people who did the versification for the Bible did it much later, and they didn't always divide the verses and chapters in the right places. This is one of those times. But if you look at the end of the first half of verse 15, notice what it says there. Anybody who tries to swim upstream, who tries to live virtuously, anybody who tries to sort of fight the system, whatever system you want to call this, they become a prey. They experience violent opposition. Now, as we conclude, that's a lot to throw at you, right? That's a lot of stuff that they observed, and we could spend a long time unpacking that. But here's what I really want you to focus on. Last week we talked about how important it is to come clean about our wrongdoing. But here's where that gets harder. As hard as it is for me to admit, yeah, I really shouldn't have done X. I was wrong to have done that. That's hard enough, right? I think it's even harder for us to admit we shouldn't have done X. The admission of corporate wrongdoing is exceedingly difficult, and people almost never do it. And yet, what I would argue is, and what we will see, I think, throughout Scripture, is that the admission of wrongdoing, whether it's individually or corporately, is absolutely vital to our healing. Yes, it's hard. And one of the reasons that it's hard is because we as Americans don't want to admit our interconnectedness. We don't want to admit that, well, actually, I might have benefited from something that, Andrew Jackson did 150, 180 years ago. We want to try to separate ourselves from that guilt, but the real reason we're doing that is because we don't know what to do with shame. We're going to start talking about shame in the next couple of weeks. But we don't know what to do with shame. We don't know what to do with guilt either. We've lost that skill of knowing how to acknowledge guilt, confess it, and let God deal with it. And in fact, I remember there was a secular, completely non-religious psychologist from the 1970s who said, you know what? You people in churches are not doing your job, because half the people who are on my couch because they don't know what to do with their guilt. And they don't know what to do with their guilt because you're not asking them to confront their sin. God still wants to heal. God still wants to forgive. God still wants to restore. God still wants to reconcile us, not only to ourselves, not only to Him, but to one another. God still wants to repair all that is broken. But the first step is confession. We've seen that as we've seen God give His perspective on sin. Now we see that as the people of Israel give their perspective on sin. It simply has to be done. Let us pray.